"I am pleased to meet you," said the stocky officer with the 3 gold stripes and the Knight's Cross under his collar. "I am Korvettenkapitan Winter. Shake hands with my staff." He introduced me to the members of the breakfast party and told the steward to set another place. Winter himself needed no introduction. His reputation was known to all of us in the U-boat force. He had compiled a remarkable record in the early years of the war, sinking more than 150,000 tons of British shipping. He was one of our last surviving aces. While I ate breakfast, Winter and the others told me the latest news. On the positive side, Schnorkel assemblies had arrived in the shipyard to be installed aboard 3 U-boats for trial runs. But almost everything else was just an up-to-date version of our familiar recent troubles. British airplanes were now flying frequent missions under cover of darkness to drop magnetic mines in the harbour at Brest and in waterways leading out to sea. The U-boat war was still stagnating while we waited for the long-promised reinforcements of new weapons and modern boats. A few of our old diving machines were still lurking around the British Isles, the object of massive air and sea hunts. Even the Black Pit area in the middle of the Atlantic, which had long been free of Allied air surveillance, was now patrolled by planes from American aircraft carriers and by swift escorts. The current balance sheet: 4 out of 5 U-boats failed to return from their patrols, a casualty rate that far outweighed our meagre toll of Allied shipping. As the conversation veered off to the war in general, I noticed that officers expressed little concern about our battle line near Monte Cassino, or even about our Russian campaign, which was not going as the army had predicted. Their talk was mostly about the threat of an Allied invasion of the continent. Nobody knew when or where it would take place, but nobody seemed to doubt that it was coming. The men mentioned our recent efforts to strengthen even further our powerful coastal defences, to repel the assault at the water's edge. Our leaders had said repeatedly that our Atlantic wall was impregnable, and no one questioned their word. Defeat was impossible. The mere thought of it seemed treasonous to us. Suddenly Winter rose to leave. "Oberleutnant Werner," he said, "you will meet the crew of your boat at 14 hours. In the meantime, make yourself comfortable and prepare something to say to your men." I took the advice of this impressive, sympathetic officer. I moved into a large corner room in the southeast wing of the complex, and soon I was splashing in my private shower, trying to compose a little speech. However, nothing sensible came to mind, and I eventually sat down at the desk to write a draft. That did not work either, so I followed an urge to inspect the compound and bunker. At 1400, I met Kapitän Winter and my boat's company in the courtyard of the flotilla. In my impromptu speech, I told the men that I was an old friend of U-415, that we had met last year at a fueling rendezvous in the middle of the Atlantic. I told them I was proud of their accomplishments and honoured to become their captain, that nothing would be changed to upset their routine, and that as long as I was aboard U-415, she would not be defeated. I shook hands with every man, and by 1420 I had taken over boat and crew. At 1425 I gave my first order, instructing the exec to have the boat ready in 30 minutes for exercises in the bay. I was determined to train the men according to my own conception of U-boat warfare. The exec led the crew downhill. I followed with the chief and the second watch officer, and asked them about their background. As it turned out, the engineer had been with U-415 since she had been commissioned, but the exec and the second officer had had only limited front experience. Clearly, I would have to assume a good portion of their duties at first. U-415 lay waiting in her berth. I lowered myself through the bridge hatch into the conning tower and experienced an unpleasant surprise. The periscope in the lower was one of the earliest designs. I was accustomed to a fully automatic tube equipped with swivel seat, electric drive, numerous gadgets, and an integrated computer system. But to use this prehistoric scope, one had to squat to look through its eyepiece, and following the up and down movements of the long shaft would be an acrobatic exercise. A thorough inspection of the boat revealed no other discrepancies except her age. She was an old workhorse. Nonetheless, the large new arsenal of radar detection gear, plus two 20mm, two-barreled guns and a sophisticated 37mm automatic compensated for the lack of an advanced periscope. All that afternoon and the following 3 days, I sailed U-415 through the Bay of Brest, drilled the men in diving manoeuvres, and let them practice on the anti-aircraft guns with live ammunition. I added a few innovations that I had found extremely valuable and which the men accepted with a well-developed instinct for survival common to all hunted creatures. I drove the men hard, bringing them to peak performance and deepening our relationship. By the 4th day, I was confident enough of boat and crew to report to Winter that we were fit for patrol. From that moment on, everything went according to routine. Duties that had been mine for years were now taken care of by my officers, and I had time enough to steel my nerves and fortify my spirit for the mission. On the 3rd day of the fitting out of U-415, I received my first operational order and met with Winter in his office shortly after breakfast. He was nonchalant as he briefed me on my assignment. "We have temporarily suspended our long patrols into the Atlantic in favour of shorter operations into areas where the convoy routes converge. Observe." Unfolding a large yellow sea chart, Winter pointed out the area that headquarters had chosen for my first battles as a captain. "You will recognise that your square is in a strategic location, commanding the westerly approach to the English Channel." Studying the chart, I realised that the bottom was at an average of 150 metres below mean water level. Operating in such shallow waters had its advantages as well as disadvantages. I also realised that enemy air surveillance and hunter-killer groups were concentrated in the area, and that there would be little chance to surface for air and a charge of the batteries. Under such conditions, a U-boat without a schnorkel could hardly be expected to survive a massive hunt by squadrons of aircraft and fleets of destroyers. Common sense told me that U-415 was doomed, and yet I could not believe that I had survived this long just to become a victim of obsolete equipment. I accepted the order, folded the paper, and stuck it into a pocket of my fatigues. Then I saluted my senior and withdrew. Finally, the hour arrived, 21:30 on April 11th, 1944. My crew had assembled aboard on the aft deck. There were no well-wishers at the waterfront, no music, no flowers. My commands echoed hollowly in the concrete bunker. U-415 sailed quietly into the shallow inner harbour, stern first, then turned and followed the nervous minesweeper into the long, dark channel leading into the open Atlantic. I had taken this route many times before. However, there was a great difference. I was now in command, with the lives of 58 men in my hands, at a time when our prospects for success and survival were at the lowest. At 22:45 our escort swung around without warning and went on opposite course. As she turned, her skipper wished us good hunting, a valediction that had long since lost its significance. His farewell reminded me that our sailing could not have been a secret, for the mounting threat of an Allied invasion had given the French population hope for an early liberation, and every dockhand, barmaid or girl in the etablissements was eager to spy for the British. With the escort's departure, I speeded ahead. We needed speed to dive, and I had not the slightest desire to shoot it out on surface. But in addition to the threat from above, there were the barriers of British mines to contend with. Although I had a tremendous urge to dive, I had to continue on surface until we were in water deep enough to overpass mines and withstand bombs from either side. And all the while, radar impulses chirped ceaselessly all around us. "New impulse bearing 140, getting louder," shouted the operator through the tube. "Take depth sounding and report steadily," I called into the control room from the bridge. 31, 32, 32. That was not deep enough for us to dive and still pass over a mine safely. "Radar impulses increase sharply," the voice came through the tube urgently. 37, 38, 40 metres. "Impulses volume 4, screamed the voice from below. "Alarm!" I waited a few more seconds, half expecting to see the searchlight of an attacking aircraft, then leapt through the hole. The boat roared with the familiar crescendo on a downward curve to starboard, but she went down only slowly in shallow waters. As I made a mental note of the fact, for never before had I been forced to dive so close to shore, the ocean exploded. 1, 2, 3, 4 detonations ruptured the sea and hammered against the port side of the hull, tossing the boat sideways each time. Then, with a hard, sudden shock, the boat hit bottom at 46 metres, without activating a mine. I doubted that there were any mines at all at this distance from port, and decided that hereafter I would disregard the standing order not to dive within the 80-metre line. At midnight, U-415 was again on surface, alone with the elements and the searching British planes. I checked the phosphorescent dial of my watch in order to establish the interval between our last crash dive and our next. 30 minutes and 9 miles later, we were again forced to dive by 3 stubborn impulses. The boat had fallen to 55 metres when 12 charges exploded in clusters of 4. The hostile bombardiers did not stint their bombs. They fully intended to destroy us. We surfaced again and crash-dived again in a repetitious game of attack and defiance. As the day finally dawned, we dived an 8th time, and with this attack the bombs wasted on us mounted to 40. U-415 floated, submerged and silent, toward the entrance of the English Channel. Soon our sound gear picked up faint propeller noises and ASDIC pings far in the west. The hunter-killer groups had reacted fast, guided onto our general track by the trail of booms left by the pounding aircraft. I lay on my bunk, eyes closed but my mind racing. The sound of the destroyer's screws could soon be heard inside the hull without earphones. For long moments it seemed that the pursuers had made contact, their pings drilled through the steel like bits. But time passed, and every hour we floated 2 miles further north-northwest. By late afternoon we finally had the ships outdistanced. The moment to surface drew steadily closer. It was the moment when we defied maximum air surveillance, when our fears and our heartbeats reached their peak. However, it was also the time when we got the air and the battery charge we needed to survive. At 22:15, U-415 surfaced into a clear night. Cool air cut into my lungs. A spanking breeze came in from the west. Sheets of spray brushed our faces. What followed was a duplication of the previous night. When the impulses reached unbearable strength, when the air was pregnant with roaming aircraft, we crashed below. The boat bent under the countless concussions, tumbled, listed, and went out of control, then levelled, balanced, and floated silently until we surfaced again into the hot exhaust gases left by our attackers. Throughout the night we played the deadly game until our batteries were fully charged. With day, submergence relieved us from the nerve-wracking exposures. For 5 days and nights, U-415 braved the barrages of bombs and depth charges. When the morning of the 6th day finally dawned, we reached our destination and met with more bombardment. On our 3rd day of cruising in Grid Square BF-15, the soundman merely whispered the discovery, "Sound band port ahead." This was the sound I wished to hear, the deep thrashing rumble of merchant ships, the rhythmic pounding of piston engines. It was 09:15. The width of the band indicated the convoy was a considerable distance away. I mounted my first attack with the order, "Both half ahead, on periscope depth, on battle stations, all tubes ready for action." At once, seamen, machinists and mechanics scurried through the hull in sneakers and stockinged feet, wearing nothing but their blue knitted underwear. I leapt into the radio room and pressed a pair of earphones against my head. A mechanical symphony, fast and slow propellers, turbines, diesel and piston engines greeted my ears. The urge to stop those damned propellers overwhelmed me. I gave up listening and surged into the tower. The crew awaited my action. "Up scope! Stop! Right so!" I bent my knees before the old, still unfamiliar instrument, peered through its ocular, but saw only light green water. All of a sudden, sunlight entered the eye. The scope had broken surface. "Down, scope! Too much! Up, up, up! Down! Right so!" The vessel's black superstructures came into view, framing themselves against the light blue sky like a shadow play. They rocked and swayed eastward in perfect formation, totally unconcerned. No wonder, they had made the trip across the Atlantic in absolute safety. I swiveled around to check the waters to my back and counted 7 corvettes zealously cruising at various distances. This display of power meant I had to act fast. I downed the scope, ordered the 4 bow tubes ready for a fan shot, then checked the surface again. U-415 floated on her clandestine path toward the masses of ships. Distance diminished gradually but distinctly. The black silhouettes grew into ships, then became full-sized monsters. 4 destroyers raced into our immediate vicinity. Then I realized I would not have enough time to get as close as I had anticipated. Correction. New range, 2000. Up scope, up, down. Right so. New range 2000 stands. Cover, cover, cover. Fan shot. Ready. Fire. One by one, the torpedoes jumped from the tubes, streaked toward the imposing array of cargo ships, escorts, and trawlers. 58 men counted to the rhythm of their heartbeats. 2 minutes went by. No hit. I fixed the scope at the columns far ahead, almost hypnotized by the panorama. Then 1, 2, 3 booms in quick succession. 3 black clouds mushroomed within the herd. Then the view was sharply cut off by a huge grey bow. Emergency! Dive to 150. The helmsman moved the handle of the machine telegraph up and down 3 times. We braced for the impact. U-415 fell away, clawing for depth, her screws churning violently. Only I knew what had happened on surface, that an escort had found us because I had left the scope exposed for too long. The spread from above exploded just short of the conning tower. 6 times in quick succession, the boat was beaten and savagely shaken. For moments only the thrust of our propellers was felt, then a fresh series slammed against the hull, driving the boat further into the depths. The chief levelled her off seconds before she would have rammed into the sand. This noisy manoeuvre brought down a new salvo. We heard the canisters splash into the water, and as they floated down we had little chance to escape them. A dozen detonations, a shattering roar. Somewhere a valve blew, and a fountain of water, thick as an arm, spurted across the aisle. The escorts above us, we heard them with the naked ear, assembled for the kill. A 3rd barrage bracketed our trembling boat. Then the devilish grinding of propellers heralded another spread. Though the sun sank into the ocean and night covered the attackers, they still hurled their cans, and the concussions kept crashing our boat into the sandy bottom and blowing her off again in repetitious sequence. By 0600 the next morning we had taken 18 hours of constant beating. The chief had managed to keep the boat afloat in spite of the countless leaks, defects, blowouts, and loss of compressed air and power. At noon, the attacks had not lessened. The British attackers quite obviously took turns. We had heard new escorts arrive and take over the chase with a fresh supply. Evening came, and the bombardment continued with savage strength. We had long gotten used to the hammering pings and the threshing screws which came and went, stopped, grew nearer, stopped again, ground into reverse, came closer again, and then went into high gear. These were the seconds when the canisters tumbled down, when the explosions hammered against the coffin, when our heartbeats stopped and sparks flashed and water splashed. These were also the seconds when we were rammed into the ground and buried in silt, but found that we were somehow still alive. Midnight once again. The British had pounded use for over 37 hours, dropping more than 300 charges, and were still unwilling to halt the pursuit. At Otu-Quoife, however, an erratic movement of the killers led me to believe that they had run out of patience, or cans. Their propellers stopped, went on again, increased in revolutions, then grew dimmer. After interminable minutes, the abominable sound faded out at the eastern horizon. The sudden silence hurt our ears, seemed amplified into pounding blows, the beads of moisture dripping on the deck plates, the drops splashing in the bilges, the coughing of hard-breathing men, the ticking of wristwatches. Slowly, very gradually, stress eased, and the crew realized that the barrage was over. 1 hour later, U-415 shot upward into airy freedom. I dragged myself onto the bridge. The diesels began to roar and the ventilators to sing. The boat gained speed and raced westward in the dark. Near dawn, we dived. The chief steered the boat at 25 meters, allowing us to receive our first radio communications in over 2 days. The messages came pouring in. Armed Forces communiques disclosed that Berlin, Hamburg and Hanover had again suffered heavy air attacks, that the front in Italy had been broken and that the Soviets had launched a broad offensive in the south of Russia. We learned from headquarters that 3 U-boats had been lost while we had been hanging in the noose. U-342 had been bombed and sunk. U-448 and U-515 had failed to answer calls for days and were presumed lost. We intercepted several radiograms directed to other boats, presumed to be afloat, and one intended expressly for us. U-415. Discontinue all actions, report position, return to base at once. Obediently we surfaced and transmitted to base our position and word of our score. Knowing that our signal would be detected by the British, we braced ourselves for attacks by their long-range bombers. Only minutes were left for us to replenish our batteries. Some 300 miles separated U-415 from her concrete bunker in Brest. She could have reached it within 30 hours travelling at top speed on surface. Instead, she was forced to resume her sinuous dives into depth. For 4 days and 4 nights, we underdived and escaped the best efforts of the British to sink U-415. But finally we reached the reefs of Brittany, surfaced into a night illuminated by a sickle moon, clung to the wake of an escort, and sailed safely into the narrows of Brest. Close to midnight, our good old workhorse of a boat found her berth in the bunker. The pier was sparsely lighted. Only a few of the flotilla's brass had found the time to greet us. The boat's company stood in stony silence when Winter accepted my salute. Soon I was seated in the mess hall next to the commanding officer, and I took the opportunity to ask him a question that had bothered me for 5 days. "Sir, why did headquarters order us to return? Are we finally going to get our schnorkel?" "See me in my office tomorrow regarding these matters," said Winter. "For now, have your dinner in peace and tell me something interesting of your experiences." "It's always the same routine. Get up on surface and catch a mouthful of air. Snatch a minute when Tommy isn't looking, duck as soon as he moves around, and surface again when you think he has turned his back. The trick is to find the right moment to take your chance." Between my bites of cold pork and my swigs of cool beer, I told him of the long British pursuit which had almost made that dinner unnecessary. Long after Winter retired, the crew continued to celebrate their safe and victorious return. I spent another hour or so at the bar with my officers before I retreated into the solitude of my room. After a long hot soaking in the tub, I sank luxuriously into sweet-scented linen. At 15:30 the following afternoon I entered Winter's office. Immediately he expressed concern about my men, and I told him they were well taken care of. "Good," he said. "Now to the reason for your being called from patrol. As you probably have heard, the Supreme Command is expecting an Allied invasion in the near future. All indications point to a landing on the continent in May." "Everybody has a theory of where they might strike," I ventured. "Does anybody know?" "I don't. Norway is a possibility. Some think they might try to land on the Biscay coast, but most likely they will try to go ashore near Le Havre, the shortest distance from British ports. In any event, we have to be vigilant and prepared. Your boat will be overhauled immediately. Only the most urgent repairs will be permitted. Have her in combat order in 10 days. At that time your men must be on a 6-hour alert. Instructions about your operation and tactical deployment will be given at this office by Senior Officer West as soon as all commanders involved have assembled for our counter-offensive." Recalling his concern for boat and crew, I challenged him. "It seems likely, sir, that such an extraordinary mission will require a schnorkel. Have any provisions been made for installing one aboard U-415? "Not that I know," he said evasively. "There is simply no more in supply. I am sorry, but you will have to operate without it, and so will most of the other captains. We'll have to fight the invasion with what we have." "Sir, headquarters can't assume that we'll be able to reach the operational goals without a schnorkel." "I understand your argument fully. However, I am in no position to change the situation. I wish I could help you, but there is a limit as to what I am able to do." I left Winter's office determined to dig up a schnorkel and have it installed aboard U-415 before the Allies would strike. Measured by the great enemy power we had seen at sea, I was convinced that any invasion force would be so gigantic that none of our U-boats would have a chance to survive without a schnorkel. It was disturbing to realize how little headquarters had learned about the Allies' power, and how little our terrible losses had taught the men in Berlin. I brought U-415 to dry dock and arranged for her overhaul. Then I telephoned the shipyards in Lorient and Saint-Nazaire about a spare schnorkel, but with no success. Schnorkels were in such short supply that only 7 boats operating from Brest were equipped with the underwater breathing device. For a moment I saw a ray of hope. A shipyard engineer told me of having seen schnorkel assemblies lying around in the freight yard of the Gare de Montparnasse in Paris. However, my efforts to requisition and transport the desperately needed equipment were drowned in a sea of bureaucratic confusion. I eventually resigned myself to the bitter fact that I again had to sail without a schnorkel. For a number of days, single U-boats sailed or limped into harbour. They amounted to only a fraction of those which had been ordered back to counter an Allied invasion. During the first 4 months of 1944, over 55 boats had been destroyed, about 80% of those sent to sea. The meagre tonnage we sank in that period did not justify the sacrifice of so many boats. Their survival alone should have been of highest priority, so that they would have been available when the Reich's existence was in gravest danger. With the return of U-821, the thin trickle of U-boats ceased entirely. U-311 was sunk on her run for port, and U-392 failed to meet the escort near the rocks. U-625 and U-653 were lost in the Bay of Biscay, and U-744 and U-603 disappeared without a signal. In addition to these boats, which had sailed from Brest and were expected back to bolster the anti-invasion group, 20 boats had been sent out from bases in Norway. None of these newcomers had been equipped with schnorkel, and they also lacked the experience needed to escape the British death traps. Only 2 boats out of the 20 reached their destination. In all, only 15 boats, 7 with schnorkels, lay in Brest to defend the 1,000-year Reich against 1 million invaders. The month of May had come with a fragrant explosion of magnolias and lilacs. These scents of new life were carried across the wide pastures of Brittany by a gentle breeze from the ocean, where death prevailed. When I had departed from the coast in early April, there had been only a presentiment of spring in the air, a warm wind from the south, a few opening buds here and there. During my absence, the trees had sprung into full leaf, the grass had turned greener, flowers had blossomed, and the countryside had plunged into hot, summer-like weather. Under the common concrete roof, the shipyard personnel worked around the clock to have the 15 U-boats repaired, equipped, and fitted out for their most vital mission. Torpedoes, fuel, and food were stowed aboard simultaneously to reduce the loading period, and our machinists made scores of repairs on their own, helping to put the boats in fighting condition by the required deadline. While the activity in the shipyards slowly subsided and the invasion jitters mounted in the compound, the enemy completed his immense preparations across the English Channel. He also increased his airstrikes on Biscay ports, harassing us at any hour, keeping our flak crews chained to their guns. Night after night, groups of Allied aircraft swept over our U-boat bases, seeding harbours and waterways with magnetic mines. Day after day, our minesweepers searched for the hidden menace, and the sound of explosions echoed occasionally from the cliffs in the Bay of Brest. Large Anglo-American bomber fleets penetrated France, systematically hammering, disrupting and obliterating roads, rails, stations, depots, airfields, barracks, bridges, villages and cities, devastating the beautiful France which had been virtually untouched by the war. On one of those sunny and portentous days in May, Senior Officer U-Boats West, Capitaine José Rosing, made his expected appearance in the compound of the First Flotilla to brief us on headquarters' plan to sink the Allied invasion fleet. Corvettan Capitaine Winter played host to the high guest, as well as to the commanders of the 9th Flotilla from the other side of town. As we settled around the conference table, I took note of my colleagues in this extraordinary operation. My friend Hein Cedar, commander of U-984, was seated to my left, and to my right was Dieter Saxer, captain of U-43. There was Teddy Leston, captain of U-373, Heinz Marbach of U-953, Bodenberg of U-256, Uhl of U-269, Hartmann of U-441, Stark of U-740, Buggs of U-629, Knackfuss of U-821, Machulat of U-247, Starmer of U-354, Becker of U-218, Cortez of U-763, and finally myself of U-415. We were all young, faithful and determined to win the fight for which we had suffered so long. 8 of us, including myself, were sceptical of the immediate mission and our future deployment. Admiral Dönitz, however, had neglected to ask the opinion of those who had to do the impossible, to reach and halt an invasion fleet without benefit of Schnorkel. The group grew quiet. Capitaine Rosing patted his silvery hair, which seemed to interfere with his thinking. Not until he had caressed it into submission was he ready to speak. Gentlemen, as you know, the Allied invasion is expected momentarily. You must be in the position to sail at any hour. Because our intelligence has been unable to discover the exact date and location of the landing, I have only general instructions for you. We shall be prepared to counter the blow wherever it falls. In Norway we have 22 boats on alert. The Biscay ports of Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice and Bordeaux are staffed with another 21 boats. Most likely, however, the invasion fleet will simply cross the Channel and try to land some 20 to 50 miles from England. This is where you gentlemen step in. Headquarters' directive is short and precise. Attack and sink invasion fleet with the final objective of destroying enemy ships by ramming. Deadly silence gripped the room. 15 captains, all experienced U-boat men, could not believe what they had heard. This was sheer madness. We had battled ferociously to preserve our lives and our boats through months of defeats and mounting losses. Now, with only a few of each left, headquarters had ordered the sacrifice of all survivors without a thought for continuing the war. It was ludicrous to use a U-boat to accomplish what a torpedo should do. Was suicide the purpose for which we had been trained so long? Was this futile gesture the greatest glory and satisfaction we were permitted to take down with us into our wet graves? I regained my composure and asked our executioner, "Sir, does that mean we have to ram our boat into an enemy vessel, even if we are able to return to port for more torpedoes?" "As the order stands, it means ramming. That is the directive I have been given to relay to all of you. Gentlemen, I have to be frank. You may not get a chance to repeat the attack. That's why total assault is ordered, even though it means deliberate self-destruction." That was very clear. He was indeed precise in his interpretation of the order, and he left us no choice but to perform a German version of the Japanese kamikaze sacrifice. It occurred to me that this order might represent headquarters' admission that the war was already hopeless. But I did not dare to think further along these lines. Hein Cedar, whose boat had been equipped with a schnorkel, ventured to say, "I respectfully propose that the schnorkel boats be dispatched into the Channel at this time, sir. It would be advantageous to hit them early and often within hours after they sail and before they strike." "We cannot afford to expose our boats to the Allied defence before the invasion begins," countered our guest. "You will get the order to sail sufficiently ahead of time. We have a well-functioning alarm system established along the coast. Detailed orders will be released the instant you leave port. If you have any further questions, meine Herren, now is the time to ask them." What was there to question? We had been trained to execute orders without question. For a while, however, we 15 captains engaged in a rather one-sided discussion of points not covered explicitly in headquarters directive. Our conclusion was that we were free in our tactical manoeuvres, but once we had the invasion forces in front of our tubes, we would exhaust our torpedoes, then ram. The group dispersed. Each man went his own way, struggling to reconcile his own grim thoughts. I retired to my room, tuned in the radio, and tried to relax in the easy chair. I calculated that schnorkel-less U-boats would be prevented by Allied air and sea vanguards from reaching any given point in the English Channel once the invasion had begun. I knew that 7 of my friends would come to the same conclusion. That would leave a grand total of 7 U-boats equipped with the schnorkel, which had a fair chance of actually confronting the Allied invasion fleet. Thus, at best, 7 U-boats were all that headquarters could muster to head off an invasion in the Channel, and they would be facing, if my experience with Allied sea power was any index, an invasion fleet of virtually thousands of cargo vessels, warships and landing craft, not to mention the numberless aircraft that would blanket the scene. Of course, 7 U-boats could not hold off such a vast armada. Even the notion that they could inflict noticeable damages was an infantile illusion. If our armies and the Luftwaffe were not able to halt the vast onslaught on the beaches and drive the Allies back into the sea, good God have mercy on our souls and on Germany. The establishment of a 6-hour alert denied our 15 doomed crews any excursions in the city. Land passes had been cancelled. I took special care of my men, trying to make them forget that their bell would soon toll. Bus rides, hikes, games and plays kept the men in motion and in competition. Classes were held to further their education. Kapitän Winter did his best to make our last weekends happy and rewarding. We captains spent sunny hours in the flotilla's resort, Le Trechier, swimming in the ocean, sunbathing, playing chess or bridge with the girls from the naval administration, who had no notion of our fatal mission. We never talked about the invasion, but we thought of it incessantly, and of our death. Everything reminded us of death, especially a device that preserved life. On weekdays we could see those U-boats equipped with schnorkel training in the blue waters of the Bay of Brest. We non-schnorkelers, men and officers alike, followed their submerged manoeuvres with intense jealousy. As we watched the small schnorkel heads grazing the surface, leaving only a short, white, foamy streak in their wake, it seemed that they guaranteed life, and that without one we would surely die. On Sunday, May 28th, we 15 commanders were invited by an SS division to see for ourselves the defence measures installed along their particular section of the Atlantic Wall. We were driven by truck to the Channel coast, were shown the most sophisticated weapons, armoured pillboxes, and mobile reinforcements. Groups of soldiers put on impressive manoeuvres, displaying various techniques for repelling invaders. The division was composed of very young troops. The men were boys not yet 18, and their officers were only a little older. However, it seemed that the Army, Luftwaffe and SS were capable of thwarting a landing in its infancy, and we returned to Brest somewhat relieved. During that night, we registered 7 infiltrations by single enemy aircraft in the sky over the bay. The next morning, May 29th, I was advised by the adjutant that all U-boats were confined to their berths until further notice. "The Tommies have planted one of their mines right in front of the bunker," he explained. "A gunner on our rooftop spotted the drop. Our minesweepers will take care of the matter quickly. The basin should be cleared by nightfall." "Those Tommies," I said in disgust. "Soon they'll be laying their eggs in our beds." The adjutant knew exactly what I meant. For the rest of the day, 2 sweepers circled in the inner harbour, concentrating on the approaches to our bunker, where 15 U-boats were held captive. However, the vessels were unable to find the mine. By evening, the search was ended and the harbour opened for traffic. The matter was closed. The gunner had been a victim of the pressures that were building up inside us all. Days of tense waiting alternated with sleepless nights. The increasing air raids, the sporadic activities of the French underground, the mounting aversion we felt in our dealings with the French population, the aggressive German-language propaganda of the British radio station Calais, the fact that we soon would have a full moon in perigee and a spring tide in early June, all these things pointed to the strong likelihood of an imminent landing. And on June 4th, when a British fleet of 4-engined Liberators came falling out of the noonday sun and down upon our concrete bunker in an attempt of unparalleled daring to destroy our boats, I knew that the hour for our last performance was very near. Then came June the 5th. In the early morning hours, before the chirping birds grew lazy and silent in the day's rising heat, I took my men on the road again. We marched through the suburbs, singing cheerfully, awakening the French. The 7-kilometre hike was welcomed by my men as a departure from routine. In the afternoon, I left the crew in charge of my officers and went into town with Hein Cedar, captain of U-984. Around 1800, we checked in the office for any word of the Allied invasion. Since nothing was new, we decided to have an elegant dinner in town instead of the thinly sliced sandwiches served in the compound. We entered one of our favourite places, selected 2 large live lobsters, and had baked snails as appetizers. Cedar and I enjoyed the classic Breton dinner, but missed the pretty girls of Brittany who had recently become so shy and retiring. I thought of Marguerite in St. Denis, and regretted that I probably would never again be able to see her or Paris. The compound was silent and darkened when we returned. All the lights had been dimmed, all the men seemed to be sleeping. Only the night watch and some operators in the radio room were on duty. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by the sound of fists hammering against my door. The steward's voice cried frantically, "Emergency! The Allies have come! Emergency!" I was at the door within a second. "Where have they landed?" "In Normandy, the invasion is in full swing." Away he sprinted to awaken my friends. I turned on the light and looked at my watch. It was 3:47, the date June 6, 1944. I thought with disgust, while the Allies had boarded their ships and landing craft, had warmed up their fighters and bombers, had sneaked across the channel to hit in surprise, we had been asleep in white linen 200 miles from the place where we should have been. Strangely tense, yet calm, I slipped into my battle fatigues without a shave. Little remained to be done. Methodically, I collected my belongings, bundled and stored them in my closet, secured my toothbrush and a small tube of paste in the chest pocket of my green blouse, put on my lambskin jacket and locked the room, walked downstairs, out of the building, down to the bunker. My call had come. I would not return. My crew was already assembled on deck for the roll call when I crossed the gangway. The exec saluted. "All men are on board, sir. Boat is ready for patrol." I touched the peak of my cap and faced the file. "Stand at ease. Men, you all know that the enemy has landed, or is in the process of doing so. We are no longer able to prevent that. But what we can do is cut off his supply and stop more troops from crossing the channel. We shall try our best. Prepare for immediate sailing, man your action stations." There was no need of telling them the whole fatal truth. As far as my men were concerned, the mission would be just another normal one. I paced up and down on deck, awaiting the signal to sail. Alongside lay U-629, commanded by Bugs, with whom I had emptied many a bottle of wine in Le Trechier when the accent was on life and recreation. Although we sensed that our last battle was but a few hours away, we nonetheless managed to exchange a smile and good wishes. Then I continued to pace the deck. The minutes ticked away. An hour passed without action. Another hour. Then the decisive night slowly died. A new day dawned hesitantly over the coast of Normandy, where the greatest invasion of all time was in progress. A prodigious fleet, over 4,000 landing craft with 30 divisions of Allied troops, 800 destroyers, cruisers, battleships, warships of all sizes and classes, was about to reach the continental shore, which was being pulverized by the bombardment of over 10,000 enemy planes. Meanwhile, divisions of paratroopers rained down behind our coastal defences, and countless gliders landed laden with men, tanks, guns and supply. While the French soil rocked under millions of exploding bombs and grenades, while the first waves of the intruders were decimated by the concentrated fire of the defenders, while only a few hundred of our own planes found their way into the sky, while the resistance of our tanks and guns and human walls slowly crumbled under the ponderous assault from the air and the sea, while all that happened, 15 U-boats waited under the protective cover of the concrete bunker in Brest, 21 more lay in other Biscay ports, and another 22 remained safe in Norwegian fjords. At 1,000, still no order to sail. Not a single word of command had reached us. Our men brought radios up on deck to listen to the news. Our networks flooded the Reich with reports of the Allied landing. They told of our army's heroic resistance and of how they threw the waves of intruders back into the sea. Fanfares and military marches were interspersed to confirm that the nation's greatest battle would certainly end in victory. The crews of the 15 boats on top alert cheered the news and tapped their feet to the martial tunes. Now orders were issued and cancelled within minutes. Confusion grew as more time passed. The boats were still at the pier at noon. Rumours and false alarms chased each other like steers in a stampede. At 14:40, we 15 captains were told to report in Winter's office. There was silence all around as Winter gave each commander sealed orders. I opened my blue envelope and unfolded the red paper which contained the Lion's long-delayed instructions. As I peered at the teletype, I froze. The bold letters fused into one another. But I managed to read, U-415 to sail at midnight and proceed on surface at top speed to English coast, between Lizard Head and Hartland Point. Attack and destroy Allied shipping. The message was even more insane than our present standing order from headquarters. It required me and 7 of my friends, all of us without the schnorkel, to remain on surface and race unprotected toward the southern English coast, at a time when the sky was black with thousands of aircraft, and the sea swarmed with hundreds of destroyers and corvettes. Clearly, we would not survive long enough to commit suicide by ramming cargo ships in the English ports. The 7 boats equipped with the schnorkel were more fortunate. They were ordered to proceed submerged into the area where the invasion was taking place. The slow underwater voyage would postpone somewhat their inevitable annihilation. Capitaine Winter was pale and grim. He pressed the hands of his captains who had become his friends. He had done all he could to make our last days worthwhile. There was nothing more he could do before madness would triumph. It was past 1700 when I returned to the bunker. The radios had been silenced. Instead, the huge vault-like structure resounded to the songs of our 800 crewmen, who remained eager to sail against the enemy even if it meant sailing straight to their deaths. At 2100, as night descended upon the Normandy battlefields, 15 U-boats slipped out into the bay. The night was clear. The stars glittered faintly in a still light sky. Soon a full moon would rise and light up our way into the Atlantic. 21:30. The 7 schnorkel boats began diving in the Bay of Brest, and one by one they disappeared at 5 or 10-minute intervals. Their departure was undetected by the enemy aircraft lurking offshore, ready to strike at anything that crawled on surface. As they marched submerged in single file through the narrows into the channel, we, the underprivileged, lay in the Black Bay near the escorts, waiting for the huge red ball of a moon in perigee to rise and show us the way. 22:30. The Coast Guard vessels began to float toward the harbour mouth. As they sailed into navigable waters, our diesels coughed to life, and the black silhouettes of the 8 U-boats swerved into single file astern of the leading minesweeper. First came U-4 Fort 1 under Captain Hartmann. As the senior among us, he assumed the lead. U-413 with Saxa followed closely. Teddy Leyston sailed his U-373 into the line. Then came U-740, Stark, U-629, Bugs, U-821, Nakfuss, U-415, myself at the helm. U-256 with Bodenberg closed the long chain. The moon had risen fully above the horizon in the southeast. Standing like a giant lantern in the sky, it illuminated the long row of U-boats and was sharply reflected in the calm sea. Contrary to common procedure, all the men had put on their yellow life jackets. The bridge had been stacked with piles of ammunition. The conning tower turned into an arsenal. The gunners hung at their automatics in tense expectation of the first enemy plane. I stood in my nook, trying to keep my boat directly in the wake of U-821 and to hold the distance to a prearranged 300 metres. 2310. The first radar impulses were picked up by our Bug and the Fly as the coast receded. The report from below: 6 radar impulses, all over forward sector, increasing in volume fast, alarmed every hand on the bridge. All ears turned into the wind, all eyes searched the quarters ahead. I kept my gaze circling above the armoured superstructure, but the intense moonlight revealed no winged black monsters. 23:20. The head of our procession reached the open sea. With the escorts still in line, the 8 boats sliced the silvery surface and drove ever deeper into the enemy's defence. The scream of high-volume radar impulses and the stream of emergency messages from below never ceased. 23:40. Sudden fireworks flared up in the forward port quarter 5 miles ahead. We had been warned that several of our destroyers were en route from Lorient to Brest, and we should not mistake them for the British. I focused my glasses on the disturbance and sighted 7 destroyers in an athwart formation, fighting off a British air attack. Thousands of tracers were exchanged, and brilliant flares parachuted down upon our vessels, adding their white light to the yellow moonglow. The sound of gunfire and howling aircraft engines increased as we drew closer to the battling forces. The Tommies, noting our approach, halted their wild attacks to avoid being trapped in the crossfire between U-boats and destroyers. The destroyers raced eastward past our long file, and our trawlers, seizing the chance for a protected trip home, swerved out of formation and fastened onto the destroyer's wake. Their sudden manoeuvre left 8 U-boats at the mercy of the British. At that moment all 8 U-boats acted in concert, and I ordered, "Both engines 3 times full ahead. Shoot on sight." June 7th. At Iro 15, our long chain of boats was racing at top speed toward the Atlantic. The diesels hacked, the exhausts fumed, impulses haunted us all the way. I found myself glancing repeatedly at my watch as if it could tell me when the fatal blow would fall. 0:30. Radar impulses chirped all around the horizon, their volumes shifting rapidly from feeble moans to high-pitched screams. The Tommies were obviously flying at various distances around our absurd procession. They must have thought we had lost our minds. Sometimes I could hear aircraft engines at fairly close range, but could not spot a plane. The hands of my watch crept slowly ahead while the British waited for reinforcement. Our eyes sharpened and our hearts beat heavy under our breasts. 011-2. The battle began. Our leading boats were suddenly attacked. Tracers spurted in various directions. Then the sound of gunfire hit our ears. Fountains reached into the sky. 01-17. One of the enemy airplanes caught fire. It flashed comet-like toward the head of our file, crossed over one of the boats, dropped 4 bombs, then plunged into the ocean. The bombs knocked out Saxe's U-413. With helm jammed hard a port, the boat swerved out of the column. She lost speed rapidly and sank below surface. 01-25. The aircraft launched a new attack, again directed at the boats in the front. 3 boats, brightly lighted by flares, concentrated their gunfire and held the planes at bay. A spectacular fireworks erupted, engulfing U-boats and aircraft. Suddenly the Tommies retreated. Radar impulses indicated that they were circling our stubborn parade, regrouping for a fresh attack. I raised myself over the rim of the bridge, straining to see and sound out the roaming planes. 01:45. The boat at our stern, the last one in the column, became the target of a new British tactic. Trying to roll out the carpet of fire from the rear, a 4-engined Liberator came roaring down on starboard, diving for the bow of U-256. Bodenberg's men opened fire, but the aircraft veered off in front of the boat, where her guns became ineffective. That was our chance. "Open fire!" I screamed. 5 barrels, all that we had available, blazed away at the Liberator as it dropped 4 depth charges ahead of U-256 and roared past us. 4 giant water columns leaped skyward behind the riddled aircraft as it tried to escape our fire, but some shells from our 37mm gun hit the plane broadside. It exploded in mid-air, then plunged into the sea. U-256, beaten and mutilated by the depth charges, lay stopped and helpless in our wake, slowly falling out of line. That was the last we saw of her. Realizing that her demise left us the first target in any new attack from the rear, I called for more ammunition. Radar impulses increased rapidly. For a while, however, the British held back. 02:20. Impulses now from starboard. I presumed several planes were approaching. Suddenly, a Sunderland shot out of the night from starboard ahead. I yelled, "Aircraft, starboard 40, fire!" Short bursts from our 2 twin 20mm. Guns followed the sweep of the plane. It cleverly flew in from dead ahead, making our guns ineffective, and dropped 4 barrels in front of our bow. Simultaneously, a Liberator attacked from starboard, bearing 90, firing from all its muzzles. An instant later, 4 detonations amidships. 4 savage eruptions heaved U-415 out of the water and threw our men flat on the deck plates. Then she fell back, and the 4 collapsing geysers showered us with tons of water and sent cascades through the hatch. This was the end. Both diesels stopped, the rudder jammed hard, astarboard. U-415 swerved in an arc, gradually losing speed. Above on starboard floated a flare, its treacherous glare enveloping our dying boat. U-415 lay crippled, bleeding oil from a ruptured tank, slowly coming to a full stop, a target to be finished off with ease. Bewildered, I peered down through the tower hatch into the blackness of the hull. All life below seemed to have ceased. I feared the boat might sink at any moment and ordered, "All hands on deck, make ready dinghies and lifebuoy." Not a sound came from below. The men must have been knocked out by the blows. Interminable seconds passed. From the distance came the drone of planes regrouping for a new assault. It had to be fatal. Suddenly some men came struggling up the ladder, shaken, mauled, groggy, reaching for air, tossing inflatable rubber floats to the bridge. As they jumped on deck and prepared the dinghies, the gunners raised their barrels toward the invisible airplanes circling their disabled prey. The speed of the attack and the resultant damages prevented us from sending a distress signal. This, I thought grimly, was the way many of my friends had died. The silent way, leaving no word. U-415, hopelessly damaged, lay waiting for the coup de grace. Since the boat did not seem to be sinking, I told my men to take cover behind the tower instead of lowering the dinghies into the water. I was determined to remain on board as long as the boat would float and to shoot as long as there was ammunition and men to handle the guns. It turned out, however, that we would not die unreported. The radio mate managed to patch up our emergency transmitter and sent headquarters news of our destruction. 0228. Increasing engine noise heralded a new attack, a fresh approach by Sunderland from starboard ahead, guns blazing. Zooming over our bridge, it dropped 4 canisters. 4 deafening booms tossed the boat aloft. At that moment, a Liberator attacked at low altitude from port ahead. Our men on 220mm guns started firing at once and emptied their magazines into the plane's cockpit. The black monster swept across our bridge, dropped 4 charges, then zoomed away, blowing hot exhaust fumes into our faces. As the boat made 4 violent jumps to port, and as 4 white mushrooms soared high alongside our starboard saddle tanks, the gunner at the 37mm automatic sent a full charge of explosive shells into the bomber's fuselage. The flaming aircraft plunged into the sea. Somewhere, the sound of the Sunderland's engines faded in the distance. Then all was very quiet. The flare still flickered on the surface next to our boat. U-415 was near death, but still afloat. The fly and the bug had been shot away. We were without a warning device. The bridge was punctured by many projectiles. A gunner lay scalped by a shell. Other men had been hit by steel fragments. The exec moaned in pain, his back badly lacerated by countless splinters. In the aftermath of battle, I felt hot. Assuming I was sweating, I wiped my burning eyes. But my hand came away red, and I realized that blood was streaming down my face. My white cap was punctured like a sieve, and the tiny fragments had torn my scalp. Then I heard the chief's voice from below. "Boat is taking heavy water through galley and bow hatches. Strong leak in radio room. I'll try to keep her afloat if you keep the bees away." "Can you get her repaired for diving?" I shouted back. "Can't promise. We have no power, no light. We'll do our best." I lowered myself to the slippery deck. It was split in several places by the impact of depth charges which had hit the planks before falling into the water where they had exploded. One barrel had bounced off the starboard saddle tank and had left a deep dent. Far more serious, the starboard aft ballast tanks were split wide open. Diesel oil escaped in a thick stream, spreading rapidly over the surface. With each minute of truce, the danger of a new assault increased rapidly. The boat swung softly in the breathing ocean, paralysed, seemingly dead. The next disaster and defeat, 285. 20 or 30 minutes had to bring the finale. With every heartbeat we expected another attack or the boat to slip away from under us. Suddenly the chief's creaking voice escaped the hull. "Boat is ready for restricted dive. 20 metres. No more. Only one motor good for 80 revolutions." "Can you hold her at 20 metres, or will she go to the bottom?" "I can't tell. We ought to try." I tried. Quickly the men climbed up the bridge and dropped one by one through the round opening into their iron coffin. I watched the deck gradually sink below the surface. As the water crept up to the bridge, I slammed the lid shut. Seconds later, the floods engulfed the boat. The interior looked as if a tornado had struck. In the shimmer of emergency lighting, I saw that the floor plates were strewn with pipes, ducts, cables, glass, hand wheels, bunks, tables. Water gushed from the leak in the radio room and poured through the bow and galley hatches. Both drive shafts were bent, the starboard shaft so severely that it could not be turned. The forward batteries were cracked, and the acid had flooded the compartment. Our radio room was a shambles, and the gyro compass was wrecked. The depth finder was shattered, the electric and diesel compressors were demolished, both periscopes were out of order, the starboard diesel was knocked off its foundation, and the main centrifugal pump was ruined. Since the rudders and hydroplanes were jammed, I ordered them operated manually. Gentle, silent running. Only the fine humming of the one electric motor and the muffled clanking of tools could be heard. The stress, the terrible strains on body and mind slowly faded. For hours we glided along, myself at the control and the chief supervising the repairs. We travelled almost blind, steering only by an inaccurate magnetic compass, always aware that the boat might suddenly fall away. 10:27. A sudden shock rocked the boat at 27 metres. 2 more shocks followed. She had hit the reefs, off the coast of Brittany. It was a terrifying situation, for I had no scope to use to orient myself. "Right full rudder. Blow buoyancy tank 3. Steer 270. Another shock, and another, then a piercing sound. The drum made a violent jerk and lunged up to 15 metres. 1, 2, 3 sharp clanks, an unearthly grinding, and the boat shuddered under a new collision. The force of impact almost tossed her to the surface, where we would not have lasted longer than a few minutes. Then the boat swung lazily onto a westward course, which I thought would carry her clear of the deadly rocks. 10:45. The chief dropped from the conning tower and reported the upper scope repaired. I took his position in the tower. When the eye of the tube finally cleared the water, I was shocked to see black rocks looming up all around us. Atop one huge pinnacle to the northeast stood the lighthouse of Quessant. We had been caught in the current, which would soon dash us against the sharp rocks. Recoiling from the terrible vision, I cried, "Chief, what's the highest revolution for port shaft?" 120. Make it 150, or we'll crash into the cliffs. Through the scope, I spotted a squadron of low-flying planes, then focused on the lighthouse to check our progress against the current. There was no forward motion. I hollered, "Chief, give me another 50 revolutions." "I can't take that responsibility. The motor is going to bust," he screamed back. "The hell with responsibility. Give me 200 and make it fast." Soon I felt the increased vibration. I focused on one of the threatening rocks. The boat made some headway westward. With agonizing laziness, she crept toward the exit of the trap. 40 minutes later, we had outflanked the westernmost rocks, and I mopped my sweaty neck in relief. After the tide had turned, I swung U-415 on her previous southbound course and reduced the revolutions of the shaft to a safer 100. 1300. The chief brought me the shattering news that we would run out of power in less than 2 hours. If so, we would have to scuttle the boat. But I was not ready to give up the ship. I hoped to reach the usual pickup point with a bold surface dash. 1330. Periscope depth. The sky was alive with aircraft flying in formations of 4 and 6. Land was nowhere in sight. 1345. Periscope depth. A squadron of 2-engined planes skimmed the surface a mile to the north. 1358. 2 Liberators flew in from the east. I retracted the scope and waited. 1410. Up scope. An unevenness at the southern horizon convinced me that we were nearing the outermost cliffs of Brest. A quick check. 3 2-engined aircraft had sneaked in from astern. I downed the scope as fast as its motor allowed. 1418. There were no black dots defacing the blue sky. It was our chance to try the dash to the point of rendezvous and radio for help. 1420. The boat broke surface. As I reached the bridge, the brilliant sun blinded me. The one diesel coughed and the sluggish boat gained speed slowly. I nervously scanned the sky while the radio mate fumbled with the dials of the emergency transmitter trying to send the vital signal for air cover. Then minutes of solitude on the bridge. The boat limped through the hostile sea, trailing a flag of heavy oil. For inexplicable minutes the sky remained empty. After improbable minutes, we arrived at the calculated intersection with the escorts. I turned the boat east to reduce the distance to land. But then our time expired. 5 2-engined planes appeared over the horizon astern. We dived instantly. Disaster. The boat, drained of electric power, went out of control, drove her stem into the bottom, then settled with a hard jolt at a depth of 42 metres. Long seconds later, a spread of explosions bellowed above. Water gushed into the boat and splashed over the floor plates, filled the bilges, and threatened to flood the electrical compartment in the stern. The water increased the weight of the boat tremendously, and if the enemy kept us submerged too long, U-415 might never be able to lift her weight off the bottom. High water short-circuited the power supply for our only working pump. The chance to lift the boat grew dimmer fast. The hull was as silent as a tomb. Only the soft trickle of water was heard. I closed the green curtain around my bunk and considered the few alternatives left to me. I expected action from base at any time now, if anyone had heard our call. I ordered the sound gear turned on, but the only noise the mate distinguished was our own. There was still no trace of a sound in the east, where port and rescue seemed so close. I decided to risk waiting another 2 hours, then try a lonely breakthrough. Faint propeller noises, dead ahead. The mate's voice electrified me. I joined him, putting on an extra pair of earphones. The escort's sound did not increase. It soon diminished completely. I felt the entire weight of the masses of water above the boat physically resting on my own body. Had the escort stopped? Was our fix inaccurate? Had they been attacked by planes and been sent running back to port? The sound reappeared and grew louder quickly. The threshing noise of 2 propellers stood out clearly. I had to act fast, or the vessels would turn away from the empty surface. Blow all tanks. The air swished into the tanks, but U-415 lay motionless. Stop blowing 1 and 3. All men to the rear. No movement from the boat. All men to the bow. Blow all tanks, I cried. All men aft. I broke out in a cold sweat. All men to the bow. Run, fellows, run. The compressed air ceased to flow. All men aft again. Then, very gently, the boat began to sway. She listed, shuddered, then rose and rose. U-415 had worked herself free. With a distinct shock, she broke through the surface and lay abruptly still. I flipped open the lid and popped into darkness. The 2 shadows short of our bow swung around. I signalled by lamp that we were incapacitated and could make only 5 knots. At once, one of the escorts turned and set herself in our wake. Thus taken between the 2 vessels, U-415 began her slow march into port. Manoeuvring with difficulty on our 1-lame diesel, I aimed my ship toward the illuminated square in the bunker, where I saw a few black figures waiting on the pier. The bow bounced off the concrete head wall, but the lines, already fastened at the pillars on land, held the boat steady. The moment the gangway was down, Capitaine Winter rushed aboard and pressed my hand. He was visibly moved. I am glad to see you and your men again. You better get your face cleaned. You look like a pirate. Send the boys to their quarters and let them rest. See me later, whenever you are ready to talk. He turned toward my men, saluted, then returned to the pier.